Hello everyone, we are from Group 4. We will present our material about discourse and the news. Our group members are Melastariani, Naomi Halida, Jas Jumarani, and Engel Pangestu. Please attention with our explanation. Enjoy watching.
News is about the events having public scale which happened recently. Its main interest mostly deals with negative things concerning war, famine, accident, and disaster. So there is a phrase, bad news makes good news. And then news favors the immediate, the concrete, and sometimes it favors the personal thing. News values are the characteristic to define some core qualities of mainstream news, which then becomes crystallized into the content of newspaper and news program. So news needs to be culturally relevant, unambiguous, and it focuses on powerful or elite person or group. Those characteristics of news are thrown into sharper relief by considering an instance of what might be called anti-news drawn from a daily news program. Daily news program is an evening look at the day's event. It provides a mix of hard news and commentary with some human interest items, and it features a recognizable headline that is put in an innovator slot called Your News on PM program. It airs in the end of program by the presenter. These are the two typical examples read by the presenter. In terms of discourse, the didactic center is serial sets of first person, which is I, as the actor, agent, or experiencer. And other participants like my son and mom is identified by relation to the person didactic 0 points. However, the didactic center of mainstream news discourse is the news organization or even the news itself, and hard news tends to avoid the first person. Therefore, mainstream news has to offer reliable, neutral, and current factual information that is important and valuable for citizens in a democracy. The discourse of newspaper. News discourse helps to shape the ideology of the news so people can know the opinions implied by the author. And then analyzing news discourse as ideology in newspaper has found useful starting point in the way reader can assume that each news title has its own political bias in editorial line. So by analyzing news discourse, we can consider some news organization are more likely to be liberal or conservative. For example, it is believed that The Guardian is more likely to be liberal on social issues. There's a study at the University of East Anglia that shows how particular ideological positions were constructed in the press. The constructions of certain ideological positions that were built in the news pivoted around grammatical choice in nominalization, voice like active or passive, and transitivity. Compare these two opening lines of news that describing the same event. There are some important differences between the Times and the Guardian. The first difference is in terms of voice. The Times used passive contraction, while the Guardian used active contraction. Another difference is in terms of lexical items. The Times wrote writing blacks for doing violence, while the Guardian wrote African demonstrators for doing disturbance. Here's another analysis example. The Guardian wrote police shoot 11 dead. This clearly emphasized the agency behind the action, which is police. And now look at the Times. It is written that 11 Africans were shot dead and 15 wounded when police opened fire on a rioting crowd. In this clause, the police are also the agent, but in active contraction. However, the Times used open fire on to describe the event, which is significantly more neutral rather than the use of shooting dead by the Guardian. So we can conclude that the Times filters the event through a lens in which public order and the rule of law takes precedence over legitimate protests. Or in simple way, we can say that the Times take the police side. Meanwhile, the Guardian favors the rights of the legitimate protest over the police, or we can say the Guardian takes the protester side.
Hello everyone, my name is Mel Starani, and in this section, I'll explain about the patriarchal ideology in the newspaper discourse. To understand the patriarchal ideology in newspaper discourse, first we have to know the concept of patriarchy. So, what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is a social system in which men hold primary power and predominated in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. The practice of patriarchal or male-dominated society has been prevalent in the world since quite a long time. Even today, it still hasn't quite disappeared from our lives. Almost every society in the world has been and mostly continues to be a male-dominated one. Patriarchy took firm roots in society. The male-dominated society is also called patriarchal society. A patriarchal society offers positions of prestige only to men. These positions exist in the political, social, and economic system of a country. For instance, traditionally, it is men who have been expected to be a part of political system and are perceived as fit the role. Newspapers are very much powerful media. It has got the power to shape the way readers understand and evaluate events in phenomena. Newspaper plays a very vital role in shaping the cognitive and social structure of the mass. Newspaper structure and content have impact on readers' mind. It can affect the way they perceive things in knowledge of the things mentioned, affecting also their belief, attitudes, norms, values, and ideologies. It can also indirectly influence their actions in future. The organization of newspaper article are: first, headline. They are designed to be short and catchy because most readers often read and recall only the headline of the news. Therefore, journalists tend to exploit them to express their ideological view of the news story they report. In the lead, in which the first sentence of the news story, they introduce the story by advancing some explanation to harness the view initiates in the headlines. The body consists of a series of detail, example, statistic, and attack that serve as concrete illustration that sustain and justify intended ideologies. In news writing, there are strict premium on space or time, and journalists are expressly schooled in compressing material to fill predetermined slots such as headlines. For example, a process that could be rendered by a clause is reduced to a noun phrase. The nominalizations neutralize what occurs as process, removing it from time, causality, and history in a way that seems to render it inevitable, while lending it spurious facticity. By analyzing a discourse of a newspaper article, we may uncover a certain culture in a specific period of its historical development through the ideology that the writer or the editors plant inside the article. The 2019 United Nations report on the progress of Goals 5 emphasizes the insufficient progress on structural issues at the roots of gender inequality, such as legal discrimination, unfair social norms and attitudes, decision making on sexual and reproductive issues, the low levels of political participation, And since criticism of this so-called gender ideology is anchored in the belief that this ideology portrays what considered to be most important role of women or maternity, that discourse contributes to the backlash against the participations of women in public discussions and in political decisions that have a direct impact on them. Take an example from a study by Kate Clark of report carried by the Sun newspaper highlights particular kinds of linguistic patterning that tend to shift the blame from the male perpetrator to his female victim. As you can see, the patterning of vocabulary therefore tends to exonerate the male preparators. This pattern operates at the level of both syntax and vocabulary. Two types of contrasting accounts seems to grow out of the contrast in vocabulary, where the victim are coded naturally or as respectable, the preparators become extra-human. Another example of the ideologically loaded expressions. Another example of the ideologically loaded expression that examine the ways in which the press was adopted in print media can be found in the use of expressions on war on terror in collection of corpus from the British newspaper. Overall, indeed, citations of war on terror tend in any case to be more common in opinion and comment sections of the broadsheet press than in straight news reporting or the tabloid press, which tends to be handled from the outset in the news discourse of rhetorical fulcrum in argumentative prose rather than as simple referees expressing. This approach to patriarchal ideology in press is rather different from the other analysis since the incidence of pattern is tracked over time through large corpus of data. The interpretation of expression is supported by attention to its collocational environment, and this approach does not assume a simple determining effect by the text on reader but acknowledge.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Engel Pangestu, and today I'm going to present all of you about narrative discourse and professional ideology in the news. I hope you enjoy. Discourse in news and speech. Discourse in news tends to operate differently than in real life. A study by Labov and Waletsky shows that real-life interactions are more direct and constructed chronologically than those in news. Discourse in news follows a behavior of presenting information with the most important piece of information being presented first, followed by less important informations. This technique is referred to as the reverse pyramid. So as you can see from the slide, this is a comparison between conversational speech and news speech. So in conversational speech, you would have a structure that is more traditionally structured. So it would be structured more chronologically than news speech. As you can see from news speech, the way it is constructed is that the piece of information that has more interest is going to be shown in the top order of the information list. So for example, in conversational speech, a driver drives into a busy highway. Then it resulted into an accident. The police were called and they found drugs. The victims were taken to the hospital. But in news speech, it would be drug use resulted in a car accident. The police were called immediately. Victims were taken to the hospital. As findings shows, the driver used several medications before driving into a busy highway. Some people might be wondering, why do we use reverse pyramid? Well, the reason the reverse pyramid technique exists is because of news value. Journalists put out the most relevant and newsworthy news in the upmost or first article, notwithstanding the actual chronological order. This technique also makes editing significantly easier. Even though objectivity is sometimes debated in newsfield, a journalist could at least structure their information in an order of interest while maintaining as much credibility to the source. Now let's talk about the historical background and the purpose of this analysis. In contrast, after the introduction of telegraph and press agencies, journalists wanted to present their compiled information as objectively possible to prevent offending any of their partisan newspaper clients. This urge to seek objectivity affects the way the reverse pyramid is constructed. Ultimately, objectivity becomes a main tool for journalism. However, even if journalists try to be objective as possible, it's not always applied properly. As humans, we tend to construct reality rather than reflect it. Much of our ideological background is involved, and this might affect the way an article is written. Sometimes a strong social ideology plays a part, such as patriarchy or state ideology. The analysis of ideology in news helps us to find the possible inaccuracy in news information when compared to real life happenings.
The next is beyond considerations of power and ideology in news discourse. I'm just Madani, my student number is 25. There are some points in this subtopic. The first one, in the case of the critical discourse approach to newspapers, the analysis is shaped by the ideological concern of the analyst with, for instance, racism, sexism, the treatment of minorities and so on. There is a tendency for it to associate a particular form with a particular function, whether this be agent deletion at the level of the clause associated with ideological suppression of the agency of key social actors, or nominalization associated with the naturalization of social processes. In respect of nominalization, has shown how reductive it can be to assume a simple correlation of ideological rule with the form. The second point is there has been a tendency to approach newspaper discourse as symptomatic of concerns defined elsewhere within a generally critical account of the role of the media in mass society. As a result, analyses have tended to overlook the specific character of news discourse as displayed, for instance, in terms of the wide variety of text types of genres implicated in nearly all news outlets. The next, the approach to broadcast news is also not immune to this criticism. The the overriding focus of much research on the adversarial political interview has far outweighed attention to other kinds of news interviews, with the consequent ignore to another interview types such as first, the interview between journalists themselves; second, the interview with a witness, survivor, or, or bystander; third, the interview with an expert. The next important point in this subtopic is Scannell in 1998 commented mediated communication can be approached from the perspective of hermeneutics of suspicion or hermeneutic of trust. In everyday life, our habitual attitude in communication rests upon a hermeneutic of trust. We assume that communication works, that is rests, for instance, upon the rapis- reciprocity of perspectives and the cooperative principle unless and until we run into communicative difficulties. The next point, much work on news discourse assumes the upside that we cannot trust what the news offers us a version of the world. The habitual attitude of the everyday reader or viewer of the news is likely to be much more a mixture of the two, of both trust and suspicion. Work on news discourse needs to rediscover something of the ordinary systematic of communication if it is to make sense of how news works as discourse. The next point is future work news discourse is likely to explore the generic differences between different kinds of news discourse in greater detail. News discourse, after all, is a mediated institutional discourse depend, dependent, dependent for its production, for the most part, on large and costly organizational arrangements using different kinds of media platforms and capable of reaching large publics only through significant technological innovations. The way news operates in broadcasting is not the same as in print, which in any case is facing significant competition from online journalism. Okay, everyone, that's all our presentation. If any question, suggestion or additional information, you can type in comment section below. Thank you. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone.